Hey fashionistas, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we'll be drafting a bustier top with yoke. What you'll need is your standard basic bodice, which you can find on my YouTube channel in my sewing playlist. So first we're going to take our front bodice and we're going to trace this out on some pattern paper. I'm using my pencil to trace all around the parameters of my pattern, and then we'll be adjusting this to create our bustier. But this is definitely the starting point for any bustier type patterns, and having a standard bodice block around is definitely a go-to when you want to create these patterns. So I'm going to make some markings at my chest and bust line on my pattern, and I'm going to take my ruler and connect these points on my new pattern. My bust points. Keep in mind that the curvature of this or these lines that we're working with ultimately determines how fitted our bustier top will be. As such, even though we have used a straight ruler to make these connections, we always go in with our French curve to smooth these points out and make it a bit curvier. The French curve is the perfect tool to have on hand when you're working with projects like these that require certain curvatures, such as around the bust, the hips, the armhole, you name it. After which, I'm going to take my French curve again and curve out these lines that we had made above the chest. And I'm going to do this by using my pencil, of course, and making the markings, connecting the points that we originally joined together using the ruler. So we're just curving this out, as I mentioned. So depending on how deep you like your neckline to be, I'm measuring about 1.5 inches above my chest line, and I'm going to connect this point once more using my French curve. You could make this sweetheart neckline much deeper or much shallower if you so desire. I'm then going over to the side of the pattern and I'm going to connect this line with my armhole line at the bottom. As I mentioned before, I'll be going back in and making some adjustments to my darts. Because the fabric is super stretchy, a wider dart would not be needed in this project. So here I'm just extending my dart legs upwards to about 1/2 inch, and then I'm taking my French curve to connect this point up to the 1 inch mark that we had made below our bust. I'm then going to go in and remove all the unnecessary markings that I will not be needing for this project. So here I'm removing the straight lines that we had made at the bust area, just so we aren't confused when cutting out our pattern. I'm also removing the initial dart legs that were too wide, and will be cutting out at the amended dart points. Lastly, we're going to bring the pattern back to its original form, that is our body circumference. Therefore, the 2 inches that we had removed at the top of the chest, we're going to add back those 2 inches to the side of our pattern, just so that it will fit perfectly. I'm then going to grab my French curve and smoothen out this area that will be our armhole line. It is very important to smoothen out this area so that it will sit perfectly on the body. As you know, it is a bustier, and therefore the curvature under the arm is very important. I'm going to go down to my waistline and do the same, just adding back the 2 inches which we have removed in our darts to the side of our pattern. I'm then going to connect these 2 lines to create our side seam. At this point, it is always safe to double check your lines, double check your measurements, true up your patterns in any way necessary. If you think that it will need more curves at the points, such as at the bust, you can always take your French curve and go in once more to make it a bit curvier, eliminate any straight lines that we have on the pattern, and basically reinforce your markings. Next, we're going to be moving on to creating our yoke, and this is the top half of our pattern. As you can see, much of the yoke is already in place. The only adjustments will need to be made is to basically close up our bustier. And we're going to do this by connecting back these lines or the darts that we had created at the top of the bust. So I'm just going to use my pencil and create a freehand closure here where our darts will be, and this will just create the bottom of our yoke. After we cut this out, we'll definitely need to add seam allowance along all of these curves because the patterns were not created separately. So I'm just going to cut and remove each pattern piece individually, and then add our seam allowance all around. So I'm just going back in and refining my curve. It is not perfect, but it is workable. Now it's time to cut out all our pattern pieces. This is the exciting part that I love so much. So first, we're going to start at our waist point and cut all the way across. We're then going to move up to our side seams and cut around the bustier section of the pattern first, leaving the yoke. After we do this, we're then going to cut away the individual bust pieces that will create our bustier. We're then moving to cutting center front and then following the curvature of the pattern and cutting out all the darts that we had created. Now we're left with the yoke pattern, and here I'm just simply cutting around all the way at the curves, at the neckline, and the center front. So we're now left with 3 pieces to create our bustier and our top yoke. All you have to do is add seam allowance to the curvature of these patterns and you're good to go. I'm then labeling my patterns as center front, how many pieces to cut. Seeing that it will be on center front, we're going to go ahead and cut 1, and then I'm labeling my side pattern as the side front, and we're going to cut 2 pieces. Here I'm demonstrating how the patterns will be sewn together to create our bustier. And then I'm going to label my yoke as center front, and we're going to cut this on fold also. I'm then indicating where my seam allowance should be added, and usually for curves we add about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch all around for seam allowance. We're just going to put this aside and move on to working on our back pattern. It's similar to the front pattern with only a few adjustments. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my back bodice, also on my sewing playlist, and I'm going to trace all the way around as we did with the front bodice. I'm then going to grab my front bodice pattern once more, and I'm going to make the chest and bust markings again at either side of the pattern. I'm then going to use my ruler to connect these 2 points, as we'll be needing them as points of reference throughout this project. Next, I'm going to label my lines as per usual as chest, bust, and waist. I'm then going down to my waistline, and I'm adding a 1.5 inch extension to my waist. This is to make up for any side darts that we'll be adding to our pattern, which will ultimately reduce the length of our pattern. So I'm going to connect the lines here and create a new waistline. Also, I'm going to connect it to my side seam to basically smoothen this out and create a new side seam. I'm then going back in with my nipple to nipple measurement of 4 inches, and I'm going to place a mark on my waist, bust, and chest line respectively. Taking my ruler, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect all of these points all the way down to my new waistline, and I'm going to work on creating the darts. So for the back darts, I'd like a total of 1 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and add 1/2 inch on each side of my dart leg. I'm then going to take my ruler and connect these points all the way up to my bust line at that 4 inch mark that we had made. So this is now our back dart, and usually the back dart is very important as it helps to cinch in the back, because as you know, the body is not straight, it is full of curves, and these darts help with a perfect fit. So I'm going to go back now and I'm going to add that 1 inch extra that I had removed for my darts, and I'm adding this to the side of my pattern. Remember, whenever we remove any amount of measurements from our patterns, we have to replace them, or else our pattern will be skewed, the garment will not fit, and everything will just be thrown off. So keep in mind that when you're removing any amount from your projects with darts, always add them back at the end. So now we're moving on to shaping the back of our bustier. As you know, it's usually curved, so I'm going to go 1 inch above the bust line here, and I'm going to mark that all the way across just to give an idea of how I want my line to be curved, and I'm going to do this at center front as well. So at this point, I decided to create a really low back for this bustier, and so I'm going to mark 1.5 inches above my original waist point before I made the extension. So you can see me doing that on the pattern, and I'm going to go ahead and take my French curve and I'm going to place it to basically pass through the 1 inch extension above the bust and the 1.5 extension above the waist. So I'm just going in and I'm curving it out as best as possible, and then I'm going to take my pencil and do a freehand curve just to neaten it up a bit. Also at the center back, I want a straight line, so I'm going to grab my ruler and do this, and then I am going to basically reinforce all of these lines. final step with completing this bustier with yoke is to create the back yoke. So remember, we had created our front yoke, now we're moving on to the back. So at the inner shoulder point, I'm just going to take my ruler and I'm going to connect a straight line down to the back of the bustier where we had made our curve. So this will now be our back yoke, and we'll be connecting it to our front yoke when we move on to sewing our bustier. Guys, please look out for that video. It is coming up on my channel shortly, and if you want to see the projects that I have completed using this pattern, then they'll be up on my channel as well. I'm now going in to basically create or readjust my dart legs to match up with the back of my bustier, because now we have a new back line for our bustier. So this is where we want our darts to fall. Next, I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm going to cut all the way around my pattern, removing my back yoke from my back bustier. Once removed, I'm going to label my pattern and indicate the inclusion of any seam allowance around the curves, around the back, wherever you see fit. And I'm also going to label my back yoke and indicate how many pieces I'd like to be cut. So with both the back yoke and back bustier piece, we'd want to cut 2 pieces for each side. And that's it for the tutorial, guys. I hope this was super helpful to you, and if you do ever decide to create a bustier or yoke pattern, please let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.